Trump's war on transgender Americans is spreading beyond U.S. borders, creating exactly the kind of international embarrassment his administration desperately wants to avoid. While Trump fights desperately in court to strip Americans of their basic identity documents, Canada has just issued a stark warning to its citizens. If you have an X gender marker on your passport, you might not be safe entering the United States. This isn't just Canada acting alone. At least 9 other countries, including Denmark, France, Germany, and Ireland, are now warning their transgender, non-binary, and intersex citizens about the risks of traveling to Trump's America. Think about what this means. America, once seen as a beacon of freedom and civil rights, is now being treated like an authoritarian state that other democratic nations need to warn their citizens about. The international humiliation runs even deeper when you consider Trump's broader pattern of aggression. Just this week, he announced plans to deploy troops to Portland, Oregon, expanding his controversial use of military force against American cities.
Donald Trump is expanding his use of military troops for domestic purposes. The U.S. president posting on social media this morning that he plans to send troops to Portland, Oregon, authorizing full force if necessary to handle, quote, domestic terrorists as he expands his controversial deployments to more American cities. There's no word on a timeline for the deployment or what troops would be involved. It's just the latest use of the military domestically, with troops sent to Los Angeles earlier this year and plans currently in place for a deployment for Memphis, Tennessee.
This is the same president who threatens Democratic allies while treating American citizens as enemies. The message to the world couldn't be clearer. Trump's America is becoming a place where force replaces freedom, where military might is turned inward against its own people. But the assault on transgender Americans represents something particularly vicious. On his very first day back in office, Trump signed an executive order that denied the existence of transgender, non-binary, and intersex people entirely. The order claimed that the federal government would only recognize 2 sexes, male and female, based on what Trump called immutable biological classification. This wasn't just policy, it was an attempt to erase millions of Americans from legal existence. The State Department immediately fell in line, suspending all passport applications with X gender markers and refusing to let Americans change their gender markers to match their identity. Existing X passports would remain valid until expiration, but upon renewal, they would have to reflect the person's sex assigned at birth, not their lived reality. But Trump's plan hit a massive roadblock in federal court. The American Civil Liberties Union quickly filed a lawsuit on behalf of 7 transgender and non-binary Americans, arguing that the policy violated their constitutional rights and federal administrative law. The case, known as Orr versus Trump, painted a devastating picture of the human cost of Trump's cruelty. Plaintiffs described having their passport applications frozen, receiving new passports with incorrect gender markers, and living in fear that they wouldn't be able to travel safely with documents that didn't match their identity. One transgender woman, Zaya Parisian, tried to update her passport before the policy took effect. She even bought a plane ticket to Canada to qualify for expedited service. Instead, she received her new passport with a letter explaining that her application had been corrected to male, a deliberate insult that showed the administration's true intentions. In June, federal judge Julia Kobik dealt Trump a crushing blow. She ruled that Trump's policy was likely unconstitutional and violated federal law, issuing a preliminary injunction that blocked the administration from enforcing the passport restrictions. The judge found that the policy discriminated based on sex and warranted the highest level of judicial scrutiny. This wasn't just a procedural victory, it was a complete rejection of Trump's attempt to use executive power to erase transgender Americans. The injunction initially applied to the individual plaintiffs, but it was quickly expanded to cover an entire class of transgender, non-binary, and intersex Americans seeking accurate passports. Trump's administration tried desperately to overturn the ruling. They appealed to the First Circuit Court of Appeals, asking for emergency relief to enforce their discriminatory policy. The appeals court rejected their request, leaving the injunction in place. Faced with this defeat, Trump's legal team made an extraordinary move. They asked the Supreme Court to intervene with an emergency appeal. Solicitor General D. John Sauer argued that the Constitution didn't require the government to adopt what he called respondents' preferred definition of sex. The emergency appeal claimed that the injunction was forcing the Trump administration to speak to foreign governments in contravention of both the president's foreign policy and scientific reality. This language reveals the administration's true mindset. They see acknowledging transgender people's existence as somehow contrary to scientific reality, despite overwhelming medical and scientific consensus supporting transgender identity. It's the same twisted logic that drives all of Trump's attacks on marginalized communities, whether through passport restrictions or the economic warfare he's waging against America's closest allies.
Difference with these tariffs, there's no carve-out for Canadian free trade goods.
That's a huge problem.
Despite the U.S. ambassador having complained extensively when Canada previously tariffed goods covered under CUSMA.
We haven't done that, but Canada has decided that, that's fair game. We will, call into question CUSMA.
After meeting with the president last week in New York, Mark Carney tight-lipped on what a Canadian response could be.
Will Canada match the new U.S. tariffs coming into effect today?
It's a broad range of issues we're discussing.
Carney has had a significant shift to his elbows-up campaign pledge, including dropping counter tariffs and the digital.
The international consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. Canada's updated travel advisory is particularly damning because it represents a fundamental shift in how America's closest ally views the United States. The Canadian government now warns that while it issues passports with X gender markers, it cannot guarantee your entry or transit through other countries, specifically naming the U.S. as a potential problem. The advisory explains that travelers might face entry restrictions in countries that do not recognize the X gender identifier, and warns that U.S. federal systems are changing to no longer accept markers of gender identity. This isn't diplomatic language, it's a direct warning that Trump's America may not be safe for gender-diverse travelers. Canada isn't alone in this assessment. Denmark, France, Germany, Ireland, and at least 5 other countries have issued similar warnings to their citizens with X gender markers about traveling to the United States. These are America's closest democratic allies, countries that share fundamental values of human rights and dignity. The fact that they feel compelled to warn their citizens about visiting the United States speaks volumes about how Trump's policies are damaging America's international reputation. These countries recognize X gender markers on their own passports and have been issuing them for years without problems. Their citizens travel internationally with these documents regularly, and other countries accept them. But now, these same allies are treating the United States as a potential threat to their citizens' safety and dignity. The irony is staggering when you consider the broader context. The X gender marker is recognized by at least 15 countries worldwide, including Argentina, Australia, Bangladesh, Colombia, Denmark, Germany, Iceland, India, Ireland, Malta, Nepal, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and Pakistan. Citizens from these countries travel globally with X gender markers without incident. The International Civil Aviation Organization, which sets global standards for travel documents, recognizes these markers as valid. But Trump's America is now positioning itself as an outlier among democratic nations, not because of strength or leadership, but because of bigotry and discrimination. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has tried to downplay these concerns, issuing statements claiming that a foreign traveler's gender, as indicated on their passport, and their personal beliefs about sexuality do not render a person inadmissible. They insist that claims to the contrary are false and that travelers just need to present valid government-issued documents. But these assurances ring hollow when the administration is simultaneously fighting in court for the right to deny Americans themselves the same consideration. If Trump won't respect his own citizens' identity documents, why should foreign nationals trust that they'll be treated fairly? The human impact of this policy extends far beyond bureaucratic inconvenience. Canada estimates that approximately 3,600 of its citizens hold X gender markers on their passports. These are real people with real lives, jobs, families, and reasons to travel. They're being told by their own government that they might not be safe visiting the United States, America, the country that once prided itself on being a refuge for those seeking freedom and acceptance. The message is clear. Trump's America is not a safe place for people who don't conform to his narrow, outdated understanding of gender and identity. The international implications go beyond individual travelers. This is damaging America's soft power and moral authority on the global stage. When Democratic allies feel compelled to warn their citizens about basic human rights violations in the United States, it undermines America's to lead on international human rights issues. How can the United States criticize authoritarian regimes for their treatment of LGBTQ people when America's own allies are issuing travel warnings about U.S. policies? This is the kind of international isolation that weakens America's position in everything from trade negotiations to security partnerships. Trump's legal team is now asking the Supreme Court to let them enforce this discriminatory policy. But the damage to America's international reputation may already be done. Even if the court were to side with Trump, which would be a devastating blow to civil rights, the fact remains that America's closest allies have already concluded that the United States under Trump is not a safe place for gender-diverse people. That's not the kind of reputation that gets reversed quickly, and it's certainly not the kind of international leadership that makes America stronger or more respected. The broader pattern here is deeply troubling. This is just one part of Trump's comprehensive assault on LGBTQ Americans, which includes attempts to ban transgender people from military service, eliminate federal protections for LGBTQ students, and roll back civil rights protections across the board. Each of these policies sends a message to the international community about what kind of country America is becoming under Trump's leadership. And that message is being received loud and clear by Democratic allies who are now warning their own citizens about the risks of visiting the United States. What makes this situation even more absurd is that Trump is fighting a battle he's already lost in the court of public opinion and international consensus. The medical and scientific communities overwhelmingly support the recognition of transgender and non-binary identities. Major corporations, universities, and institutions have policies that respect and protect gender-diverse people. America's closest allies have implemented inclusive policies that recognize the full spectrum of human gender identity. Trump is positioning the United States on the wrong side of history, science, and basic human decency. The legal challenges to Trump's policy continue, with multiple organizations fighting in federal court to protect the rights of transgender, non-binary, and intersex Americans. Lambda Legal, which represented the first American to receive an X-gender marker passport, has filed its own lawsuit challenging the policy. The ACLU continues to fight for the class of Americans affected by Trump's discriminatory order. These legal battles represent more than just policy disputes. They're fights for the fundamental principle that all Americans deserve to be recognized and respected for who they are. But the international damage may be harder to repair than the domestic legal victories. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. When Democratic allies start treating your country as a potential threat to their citizens' safety and dignity, it represents a fundamental shift in how the world sees America. This isn't about policy disagreements or political differences. This is about basic human rights and the values that supposedly define democratic societies. The Supreme Court now has the opportunity to either uphold the lower court's rejection of Trump's discriminatory policy or to side with an administration that is willing to damage America's international relationships in pursuit of its anti-transgender agenda. But regardless of what the court decides, the international community has already rendered its verdict. Trump's America is not a safe place for gender-diverse people, and Democratic allies are willing to say so publicly. This is what happens when extremist ideology drives policy instead of evidence, compassion, and respect for human dignity. Trump's obsession with erasing transgender people from legal existence isn't just cruel, it's counterproductive, internationally embarrassing, and ultimately self-defeating. While he fights desperately in court to strip Americans of their basic identity documents, the rest of the democratic world is moving forward with inclusive policies that recognize the full spectrum of human identity. The contrast couldn't be starker. While Trump tries to drag America backward into an era of discrimination and erasure, America's allies are demonstrating true leadership by protecting their citizens and warning them about the risks they might face in Trump's America. This is the international humiliation that Trump's anti-transgender crusade has created, and it's a stain on America's reputation that will take years to repair, if it can be repaired at all.